I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to the New York Winemaker Special series. Across these 8 episodes, recorded in December 2022, we'll be exploring the New York wine scene in the company of 8 different winemakers, covering the Finger Lakes in the first 6 episodes of the series, and Long Island in the last 2. We continue the series today in the company of Oskar Bynke and Fred Merwarth of Hermann J. Wiemer. We hear the pair's origin story and early days and changes at the winery. They give us a virtual tour of the winery, both above ground and below. They talk plantings in the Finger Lakes, the nursery business and its wider influence, before closing by talking about the reception in the UK market. Enjoy.
Fred Merwarth, co-owner of Hermann Wiemer Vineyard with my business partner Oskar and my wife Marisa Tosto Merwarth. I came into this starting with Hermann as an intern in 2001. I was just trying to get into the wine trade. Oskar and I had worked together at a previous endeavor for a few months, and we both realized that we were passionate about wine and wanted to get into the trade, and we thought about it from different angles. I wanted to get into the production side, and Oskar was looking from the sales and marketing side. So after we were done with this first endeavor in 2000 and 2001, Oskar finished his master's. He can tell you about that, and went off and started to learn and understand the wine trade from the sales and marketing standpoint. And I cold called Hermann and said, "Hey, I want to move to Germany to do an internship. Do you know anybody in Germany in the German wine trade that I could contact?" And I again, just super naive and just trying to figure out who to talk to. I'd grown up on a big dairy farm and within agriculture, and I wanted to come from it, understanding the winemaking and viticulture from a really strong idea of how it's done, hands-on approach. And that's how I approached Hermann. He's like, "Okay, you can start here. I don't know anybody in Europe, but you can start here." And so I started here in March of 2001 in a fairly formal practical training, and came to realize fairly quickly that Hermann knew a lot of people in the European wine trade, specifically Germany, every angle of the German wine trade, from nurserymen to glass producers to producers in the Mosel and the Pfalz. And I learned the wine trade from every angle here, from producing grapevines to sell to other wineries and vineyards, to the production, viticulture, and the sales and marketing. And that was my angle.
Okay.
And
How did you?
How did I do this? So, well, he was telling you a little bit about it. So Fred and I, we were students from Cornell University here, upstate New York. And we had this venture together after school. And then I was in the trade. And then as Hermann addressed that he wanted to retire, he wanted to slow down, but also leave. And maybe he was supposed to get an apartment in Bernkastel and go back home and relax a little bit. Fred and I had done an internship here at the winery. And Fred and I, we were then just kind of interns and new to it. But we were the only two that really could take over the winery because Hermann, he could have sold it to banker or lawyers or anything like that, but everyone wanted Hermann to stay. So then what happened was that Fred and I always say, maybe it's wrong, I say kind hostile takeover. We like, "Hey, Hermann, if you actually want to retire, there is a solution here for you." And here we are. So we started off fairly then relatively young, Fred and I, in 2007. We took over the winery. Hermann retired, and then we figured out a way to then buy him out over time. And now we're into it 16 years later. We have houses on the property, we have families, and we have a staff of 40 plus. We were 4 people then full time when we took over. So we've been a little bit on an adventure here the last almost 20 years.
Yeah, amazing. And I think that, where I kind of encourage you to kind of, flesh out the story really is, I guess, really in terms of the changes then that you put in place and the changes that have kind of occurred. Because I guess some of them would have been driven by outside forces, but I guess there was also going to be opportunities maybe that the two of you saw and I guess now had the freedom to kind of run with and to put into place post the takeover.
Yeah. If you just look at the Finger Lakes in general, I know has developed fairly quickly, and we've been able to be part of that, driving some of that as a winery. Both the quality level has increased exponentially the last 20 years. Obviously, the vines that were planted in the 70s are 40 years old, and the interest for Finger Lakes and New York wine have then attracted a lot of people here, are attracting a lot of people. So tourism have grown and acreages have grown. And so the region we've been lucky to be part of this last 20 years when the region has really developed. So with that comes also being able to spearhead some initiatives that we are able to support by a growing region. We have been buying vineyards, planting new varieties, expanding our nursery a lot, because a lot of other wineries around the country relies on our nursery. We're almost managing 180 acres now, we've taken over another winery called Standing Stone. But maybe you can address more viticulturally what has happened over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think something back to your question that really I always kind of think about is when we took over in 2007. I remember getting there was an article that came out that called Hermann's assistant for a long time took over and he's a novice at the wine trade. And not that I needed any fuel to do better, or that we needed fuel, but I remember that those first few years of what do you change? What do you need to keep consistent? How do you evolve a well-established brand, even within the tiny region of the Finger Lakes, where Hermann himself, his name's on the label. He's been entrenched in this industry for 30 plus years. How do you evolve that and still make it recognizable to your good customers, whether they're direct consumer or whether it's a restaurant in New York or a wine writer? I think that was the trickiest thing for us for those, 2007, but I say 2008, 2009, 2010 of walking that line of making changes, bringing our own ideas into it, while at the same time recognizing the work that Hermann had done and the reputation that he created, and letting those things kind of meld together and evolve kind of naturally, without pressing too hard, no pun intended, but pressing too hard of hey, this is Fred and Oskar and Marisa now running Hermann Wiemer. Took a back seat and said, hey, here's Hermann Wiemer now. And here's all the work that Hermann did, and here's our voice coming into it. Whereas now, 15 years later, 20 years, 16 years later, we are fully vocal of hey, here's the changes that we're making, or here's what we're keeping the same. When it came down to it, it was the wine itself, the sense of place that we knew that we had to not only keep but improve upon in a way that was recognizable to anyone. That if you tasted a Riesling from 1994, that you knew that a 2014 Riesling from the same spot was the same vineyard site. That was really, really critical. And I think that's maybe coming into this new world winery, but with an old world approach, if you will, that the sense of place, the sense of identity of your place was really critical to us, and it's kind of establishing that, because that wasn't really established before.
No, I think actually, because Hermann then was a little bit of a by himself here as a pioneer, to maybe together with Dr. Frank and a few others. But it was almost, I think that was a big change where Hermann was writing, I'm making German style wines, because people didn't have a reference to drier Riesling. Hermann really started to establish dry Riesling. And he was like, I'm making German style wine. While we then, going back to your question, what happened? Well, we then put ourselves and our families there, in the deep end, and got a lot of then the resources that was put in place. We started to hand harvest. We started to sort. We separated qualities. We stopped using herbicides. We're getting into biodynamic farming. A lot of changes that was positive for the quality of the wine, but also the perception of the quality of the wine. Got a lot of people like, wow, okay, these are some really good changes. And with that, we also then got proud over the results that we're doing, but also people were giving us attention. And then with that, suddenly the language was, we're now making the better Rieslings in the Finger Lakes. The Finger Lakes is now showing up as Finger Lakes wine. We are now showing off Finger Lakes. We are now all proud. This is what the Finger Lakes wines are. This is the style. This is what we can do here in the Finger Lakes. And Hermann actually had that pride in him. He wanted to show the Germans that I can make better wines than the Germans, but he always marketed us as like, I want to do German styles wine. So I think that was a big shift that we got, confidence with all our changes.
Yeah. I mean, we look back sometimes, just looking through old records, our tasting notes from the early 2000s, every single wine had, this is a Rheingau style Riesling. This is a Burgundy style Chardonnay. And like, that is, we kind of laugh at that. Just like, you're laughing a little bit. Like that was to give a reference to what was not only possible, but also a framework to say, hey, we're making wines that should be consumed in those spheres. And for a long time, as Oskar mentioned, it was really just Hermann going about it on his own, saying, look at me, I'm making Chardonnays and I'm making Rieslings that are comparable or competitive. And I think taking that little bit, having trained under that of Hermann's, like putting the flag in the ground and saying, I'm doing this, taking that kind of approach but also being a little bit more savvy or welcoming in hey, as a region, here's what we can do. That approach, I think we talked about that a lot leading into taking over in 2007, and then certainly the early years after that. So
yeah.
Also, what Hermann did if you look at the marketing side of things, he started to make sure it's important to get the name out. And I know when we took over, we had, I think, 10 or 15, maybe 20 restaurants or retailers in New York City that used our wines. And we were like, actually, that was well distributed. And then we're like, okay, we need to go at this. I got a station wagon Volvo and I hauled up and down cases. And, 5 years later, we had almost 400 accounts. Yeah. And that, now we're getting into the Finger Lakes and New York wines establishing themselves in a metropolitan market, a culinary center, where sommeliers and wine writers started to become behind the Finger Lakes. And that also helps. That helped the movement that we got the word out of.
Yeah. And this is now the fifth conversation that I've had as part of this series. And I think it helps really, having visited the Finger Lakes myself back in 2018 and actually, flown up as a sort of an add-on, really, to the New York Drinks New York program, which was the whole thing of building that closer connection between the metropolitan area and Manhattan and the New York City and New York State, which I think is, still I think there's still work and there's still potential to be done there, because there's still so many people that they don't have a clear vision, a clear feel of what, even sometimes that New York makes wine, or secondly,
very much
what
so.
it could taste like.
Oh my God, it's enormous.
Yeah,
I think still we're only scratching the surface. Yeah.
No, this is great, man, and I love the kind of interplay. I think between the two of you, and I think it will give a kind of a rounded view, really, of all of the different stories that I think are important to hear from a winery. And the kind of just to kind of switch gears, really, I'd really like to switch into what the actual physical geography of Hermann J. Wiemer is today in 2022. You've already hinted at 180 acres, I believe, and maybe giving us first a sense of how that's grown since you've taken over, but then also, what is the type of landscape that we're talking about there? What do those different acreages look like, and also bring in some of those larger geological formations that sit underneath that 180 acres.
Just to bring a little bit of his historical context to that of when I don't mean to keep referencing 2007, but when we took over, we had 63 and a half acres of vinifera on 3 vineyard sites. One of the things that has always been a challenge in the Finger Lakes is the extreme changes in weather. It can happen very quickly. It can happen where you're nice and sunny and then you're in torrential downpour. Where we've had extreme temperature changes, where we can be 20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit plus, to -5, -10 degrees Fahrenheit in a day. And those are extreme situations that not only the people living here have to go through, but obviously the vines have to go through in the vineyard sites. And so one of the things that leading into 2007, I talked to Hermann a lot about is the quality of your vineyard sites and the ability to grow vinifera and high quality vinifera. Where do you plant Pinot Noir? Where do you plant Riesling? Where do you plant Cabernet Franc? Those are almost like just entry level discussions in the wine trade around the world. Like, hey, what varietal should I plant? Where should I plant it? Yeah. But in a region that you just don't know, even living here, even Hermann growing vines for 30 years, you always question it, the quality of your vineyard site. Do I have the right varietals? Am I doing the right viticultural techniques? And I think that's in the last 15, 16 years where we have continued this discussion with Hermann that he was having 30 years prior of, you have to be diversified, not only in your varietals, but in your vineyard sites. We're constantly learning about one site versus the other. And in a way, playing the sites off of each other. Well, I get great Cabernet Franc off of there. Well, we should probably plant more Cabernet Franc there. Or, hey, Pinot Noir just doesn't seem to work on this site. Well, maybe that isn't a Pinot Noir site. I mean, what the monks did in Burgundy 1,000 years ago, we're trying to do in a very fast 15-year, 20-year approach. And I think that really leads to where we are today, that we continue to do that internal analysis of our vineyards. Is one of the reasons that we are at 180 acres is we know that in a certain year we might, and this just happened in 2022, is where you might have a vineyard site that gets hit by frost, by cold damage, by hail. And so as a producer, you have to diversify out and be kind of risk adverse in that regard so that you have fruit, that you have crop, that you have wine in the tanks to then support the company that you're growing and building.
Could you? Could you give some specific examples of that, please? Just like exactly what the aspects look like.
You can answer now. Sorry. So go back to, but I think so. If you look at the sites that we have, Fred is saying diversified. We have some sites like our home site here. We call it HJW, where the farm is, and this is actually on a pretty high up on a plateau, away from the lake. So if we look at the agricultural viability of the sites here in the Finger Lakes is often related to the lake, the long, and in this case, it's Seneca Lake. So some of our sites are close to the lake. Some of them are on a little higher up on plateaus away from the lake. And some of them have a little bit more or less slope. And with that, then the lake has different effects on it. For example, if you look at the east side of the lake where we have Standing Stone, nice slope close to the lake, you will then have a cooling effect in the summer and a warming effect in the winter, which protects the vines, but also drags out the season and tend to retain a little higher acidity in the grape. So we have really good acidity on that site. So therefore we make some sparkling wines. And you look at the home site on the west side of the lake where you have a cooler site, but you also have, which one of your questions were the bedrock here. We have shale bedrock. So if you come and traveling in the Finger Lakes and you see these beautiful waterfalls, you see layers of shale everywhere. That's the bedrock. But then on top of that, you have the topsoil, which is deriving from glacier activity when the glaciers receded back and it melted and left deposits around the Finger Lakes of everything between the finest of clays to gravel. So you're dealing with this mosaic of soils. You have obviously the site location to the lake, but then you also have the topsoils, which then makes the site, is it a vigorous site, is it a well-drained site, and so forth. And then you manage that. And that's something, going back to what we've done over the last 20 years, is to detect these sites and look how each these sites and mesoclimates performs. So you will see our HJW, our home site, which is a cool site. That is not the most vigorous site, but the acidity and the zing and the structure you get from those old vines sitting in almost full shale is fantastic. And then you go further north on the west side of the lake, where you're close to the lake. It's not so much slope, but therefore when the soil receded back, the erosion have then settled a little thicker layers of topsoil. So now you get vigor in the vine. You get easier to ripen fruit. So the ripeness up in the northern side, not only more protected by the lake, but also tend to get higher sugar levels there. And therefore you get the Riesling from the southern side to the northern side performs completely different. So a cool year, we're relying on the northern side giving us weight and alcohol and juicier flavors. And then on a warm year, we rely on the southern side to give us still structure and acidity, even if the other sides ripens. So when Hermann in the old days had 5 to 10 tanks that he then separated different qualities from the different sites. And now we have 20, 30, 40 different tanks, different pickings, and then now we separate all these qualities. So the blending of our wine is a rather complex mechanism. I would say if you look at our regular dry Riesling, it could be up to 40 different pickings and capturing all these nuances from the sites. And then we have single vineyard wines that just showcase these things. So that is something, going back to your original question, how we have been able to show off the terroir, to say, of Finger Lakes. It's in the bottle now. And that's kind of a story that we're enjoying exploring further.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I think I think a question I'd like to ask, actually, that I haven't asked so far in the series, and I actually think that between you, you're probably the best place of the guests so far to kind of talk. Exactly, no pressure. Is a sense of finding new sites now, 2022, 2023 in the Finger Lakes. I guess there's really kind of two parts. I mean, are we looking at then taking over places that have already been planted to grapes or to other agriculture, or are there also areas where nothing has been planted? That kind of sense of, how full is the Finger Lakes?
Yeah. Well,
it's a bit of both in general.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that the Finger Lakes was planted in twice as many acres prior to Prohibition than it is today. which is an unbelievable thought when you're driving up and down the roads that run parallel to the lakes on each side of, say, Cayuga, Seneca, Keuka Lake, that imagine twice as many vineyard plots, hops, fruit. The whole view was completely different and much greater planted in those crops. And I think that had a lot of tell to the companies that were planting in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of, hey, this site for 40 years prior to that never had winter damage. Amazing. All right, maybe we should try our Riesling on this site, our first vinifera planting. That's how some of these early sites really came about. They had fruit, they had hops, they had other grape hybrid or native production that ripened better, that didn't lose crop because of that really cold winter night. I think that really kickstarted the idea with, Hermann, with Dr. Frank, with the Wagners of like, hey, this is a decent site. Let's explore this more. And I think to your question, we're in that mode of continuing to look, not only as a producer, hey, should we go after more land, but also curiosity from our nursery standpoint of people are buying land and planting and like, all right, no one's put a vineyard in that 10-mile stretch of the vineyard of Seneca Lake, at least in the last 40 years. I'd be curious to see how that does. Because as Oskar mentioned, the mesoclimate variation within the Finger Lakes is so great. And I have to say, so unknown. We probably as an industry should have done a better job over the last 4 years of tracking site data, like the Burgundians have done, like in the Mosel. And I don't think that, I think that data sits with people, not on paper, of where those good sites and those protected sites are. I think for me, that's such a strong element to the Finger Lakes, such a positive about our region is that you had these mesosite differences. And I really see like kind of the next 5-10 years are starting to peel away from each site of what the specific varietals do on those sites. Where should we be planting Pinot Noir? Because I think Pinot Noir probably does have a home, but where is it? Where are the best Cabernet Francs coming from? We've had to be a little bit like, okay, we have a site, we're going to put 10 varietals on it. So here's a row of Chardonnay, here's 10 rows of Riesling, here's all planted. I mean, there's very few places in the wine world that you find that experience. I always reference Rheinhessen in Germany as a place where you go to a Rheinhessen producer and they are growing 15 to 20 different varietals because they're trying to figure it out. And at some point you start having to say, well, I should not have planted Merlot in this site. So don't do it again. Rip it out and don't do it again. Yeah. But then you start gravitating towards varietals that are working. And I think that's our next phase. I think
next phase. So the answer to your question is yes, there are even fallow land and vacant land that is being cultivated and prepared for planting. At the same time, you have the being a niche, really cool niche wine region. We have our setbacks every 10 years where things doesn't survive in the winter, and then we have to just rely on Riesling again and so forth. But things are smoothing off a little bit, and we have to learn how to handle those ups and downs. I also think something that we didn't talk about was, since we're now 40 years into it, maybe 50 years into it as a vinifera, we are now noticing the first plantings. Was that the right material? Was that the right rootstock? Did we plant that? Yeah. Should we have done east-west roads instead of north-south road? Should we have denser planting? How would we, if we have these varieties, do we reset at the same spot? I think we're there also. We have done a lot of emotionally difficult decisions, like let's just rip that Pinot out because we're going to plant Cab Franc on an angle instead because that's better, we think. So we're also analyzing what's already there now. So a little bit of both.
I love it, and I think that is actually really a perfect jump off point, really, if you like, to talk about the nursery program, because again, the beauty of talking to multiple producers there is that already your name has come up as from the wine perspective, but also from the nursery perspective, and I think that would be super interesting to kind of again take a step back from the evolution of that as a program or as a business as you like, and talk about where it started and kind of how it's going now.
It's you want to just Hermann, that was Hermann's thing.
It was
his family is a nurseryman.
Yeah, his father was in charge of the experimental station in Coos, Bernkastel Coos, from like 1951 to 1970.
Which is where, I'm sorry?
It's in Bernkastel in the Mosel.
Okay.
And this institute was responsible for research and development on rootstocks and clonal selections for Riesling, and then propagating these plants to get into the growers' hands as the Mosel was replanting and trying to recover post World War II, get the growers with better materials. And so that's the environment that Hermann grew up in. He tells me a story of paying his way through Geisenheim, the big viticulture school, and one of the big viticulture schools in Germany, through hand grafting. And so when he started here in the Finger Lakes, he started with a company. His first, he was trained as a winemaker and in viticulture, but he knew how to graft and to produce plants. So he started a small nursery. This was 1969. And when he went off on his own in 1981, he continued the nursery here basically as a way to kickstart the winery. I mean, anyone who's in the starting a winery or buying a winery knows that it's expensive. And so if you have something else to help pay your way, it's very beneficial. And so he used the nursery to help get the winery off the ground. And not in a small capacity. I mean, I look back at records from the mid 80s to the mid 90s, and he was producing 350 to 500,000 plants a year, which is not a small endeavor. That is a significant business, and really, not only here in the Finger Lakes, he did a lot of plantings to help the Michigan wine trade get off the ground in the 80s. Long Island. He was sending a ton of plants out to Mendocino, to Canaris, to Napa in the mid to late 90s. And those were at a time when someone would call and be like, I want to plant Chardonnay. Great, I have Chardonnay. I'll sell you Chardonnay. No matter the rootstock, clonal selection, nothing. It was at a time when I need Chardonnay plants. And the industry has evolved past that into what clone, what rootstock, how is it grown, what is the cleanliness, is that virus free, and so our business has continued to evolve with that. I mean, we don't just graft Chardonnay anymore. It is, hey, I'm grafting this specific selection on this specific rootstock. It's going to this specific producer in Michigan. And, I having trained in it, Oskar worked in it in 2003 when he interned here. I mean, I grafted a little bit, but Fred thought I was too slow. That's okay. I had other jobs for you. But, I really enjoy that side of the business. I enjoy thinking about plant material, where plant material has been cultivated from. Riesling isn't just Riesling isn't Riesling. There's selections from Alsace, from the Mosel, from Rheinhessen, from Australia, from Napa. And I believe that we have selections even here in the Finger Lakes. What does that mean for a producer who says, hey, I want Riesling now. Well, here's the selections. And it's really an interesting business because that information filters through into our own viticulture, into our own wine production, to then kind of circle back to say, hey, this Riesling material tastes like this or has this acid level, and be able to convey that to customers of this is what this plant material really does. There's not a nursery that really can do that. I take a lot of pride in that. We have trials and experiments in the cellar that not many wineries can pull off in terms of analyzing rootstock and clonal selections. And that has really driven our new business in the nursery of planting new selections, critiquing our own selections. What we have that Hermann planted in the 70s, is it viable plant material? What does it do on different vineyard sites, not only here in the Finger Lakes, but whether it's Michigan or Virginia, and trying to present that material as it's compared to classic material that's coming out of Burgundy or that's in Napa already. So,
yeah, and today, I can't remember what year it was, but so when we took over, we put also more energy into that, to the not only clonal selection, but varieties, but what other varieties can grow in the Finger Lakes or cool climate. So we went on a few trips. I went to Switzerland and we went around the world a little bit and looked what grows in mountain varieties are there, what varieties buds late and ripen correctly and so forth. So we we did this big tasting in New York City. We tried to gather all the somms and
wine buyers that we
wine
knew.
buyers and masters of wine. It's like, okay, this is we have a project here. We want to look around the world on varieties that could function here, but also that's marketable, viable in that sense. And we sat down with, Lisa Granick and Pascalins and the Tom Gannons of the world. And we tasted Scapatinos and Petit Arvins and Arminiers and Lagrines, all these things. And then we decided on a few, and then we started to source cuttings from certified cuttings through part of the world and through Cornell and all these things. And now, fast forward, we have then these vineyards, our northern vineyards, have these rows of Nebbiolo, Scapatino, and we are making wine from those wines. And it's very interesting then to follow how they behave, these wines behave with different weather patterns and different seasons that we are then now translating into wine. And we've done the same thing with just Cabernet Franc clones, to clarify what you're saying. So where we follow from A to Z how different rootstocks and varieties perform, where we know that the only difference is the variable is the material. Same winemaker, same picking patterns, same winemaking techniques, no other influences. And that is fascinating. That, as you say, full circle comes back and we can actually analyze this. So go back to what has happened over the last year, the agricultural know-how. I'm allowed to brag about this? I'm going to say nice things about you.
You don't have to, but you can brag about us.
The experience and the knowledge that we've been able to gather with all of this, together with Cornell as an agricultural institution and research station, it's quite interesting. With that.
I love it, and as has been the case really with all of the interviews of the series, there's obviously so much more than we can kind of fit into the reasonably limited time that we have here. But I think this will at least open people's minds and I think pique a lot of people's interests about exploring. But where I'd like to lead us in closing really is actually to the market. So all of these amazing things that you've kind of given us a peek of behind the curtain, but really then bringing it back to something quite practical. I think specifically for the UK market, because I think that is where a lot of my listeners are based. A lot of people will be in the wine trade, will be sommeliers. I think will be curious about all of the the different quite geeky elements that we've been talking about. But with the added plus of they've got access to the wines, they've got a route to actually find these wines. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind just giving us a snapshot of what's available in the UK, what's some of the feedback been like, and how might the range sort of look to evolve going forward.
Yeah, we've had a very positive experience in the UK with our wines. I think, I think it seems like the UK market is a curious one. I know you have your own domestic production, but a lot of, if you look around the countries around the world, countries who does not have a domestic market tend to look outside.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny. We have our distributor, Wanderlust, Richard, and he said, we want this because I have these customers who are so curious about the niche market of Finger Lakes, and everything from our biodynamically farmed single vineyards, HAW dry, lean Riesling, and our regular dry Riesling, which is our kind of benchmark Riesling, is available. But even the late harvest, the Spätlisses, are available, and the Cab Franc. So a nice selection. We see some interest, as you're saying, from sommeliers and nice restaurants who are like, oh, this is so cool. I saw a little Instagram reel the other day. There was someone who did a tasting with our single vineyard dessert wine. So it's been very positive, the British market or the UK market. And but he said, you know what? We do not. It's funny, by the way, Decanter wrote something very nice about our sparkling program, where they've been writing good things about it. But Richard said, no, we do our own sparkling wine. So we do not, unfortunately, export any sparkling wine to each other. Is a strong suit for us here. But all the other wines except the sparkling wine you can get.
I love it. And I think, again, the people who are listening will want to dig deeper, really, into the things that you've spoken about there. So, where should they find you on the internet, be that website, be that social media, or any other channel?
So Dan Belmont, Good Wine, Good People, he has a focus on some New York wine. That's a good place to go and find New York wines, Finger Lakes wines. And
our website is really quite good for the trade. Also, it has a lot of information about general information. It has nursery information. It has specific wine tech sheets. If anyone is curious about that, it's Wiemer, WIEMER.com. And in the New York market, we're with Skurnik Wine Spirits. They always have a lot of information about our wines on their website. But we are geeky in that regard, that we want people to know where the wines are grown, how they're grown, and the presentation of the sense of place behind them.
A huge thanks to Oskar and Fred of Hermann J. Wiemer Vineyard. Please do help to amplify this fantastic episode and the series so far by sharing the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/480. You can find links to all episodes from the series in the description below. Next time on Interpreting Wine New York Winemaker Special Series in episode 481, I'll be speaking with Christopher Bates of Element Winery. Make sure you're subscribed to Interpreting Wine Podcast to be alerted when the episode goes live. See you then.